Thanks everyone for coming along today. It's great to see such a lovely audience. I'll start with this photograph to show you Maiwar, the lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people. And this is the iconic photo of the 1974 floods to get us started. So the summer of 1973 and 74 was actually one of the wettest summers in decades. Intense rain fell throughout the entire state in 1974 and it left most of our rivers and large parts of Queensland completely submerged. Cyclones Una, Vera and Wanda were major contributors to our rainfall, and as we've seen, cyclones are often a contributor to our rainfall. Cyclone Vera in particular had moderated to a tropical low that then developed into Cyclone Wanda and it crossed the coast around Gympie on the 24th of January before moderating into a very slow moving rain depression which developed into a large monsoonal trough. As the deep low pressure system oscillated over the Brisbane River catchment, it arrived on Australia Day weekend. The city experienced 3 separate periods of intense rainfall between the 25th and the 26th of January. And you can see the rainfall map, you can see the intensity is those colours. One of the things that's worth mentioning up front is up here is Somerset Dam. Somerset Dam was opened in 1959, so this is one of our first really highly regulated floods. Hydrologists talk about favourable and unfavourable floods, and an unfavourable flood is a flood that the rain falls downstream of the dam, and this is very much an unfavourable flood. So that water was largely unmitigated because of the effect of where it landed. So rain actually fell throughout the entire river catchment, Brisbane River catchment, and Brisbane got 314 millimetres of rain on the 26th of January alone. And to give you some context, that's actually more than the average monthly rainfall. In 26 days in January, Brisbane received 872 millimetres, which was second only to the amount of rain that they got in February 1893, which is actually the biggest recorded flood that we really have data for. There was another in 1841, but it was really the 1893 floods, 2 of which came in a fortnight, that really are our watershed moments. So these produced the second and third largest floods, and this is the next closest. Most of the rain arrived in little more than a week. On the 25th of January, Brisbane's metropolitan creeks, the usual trouble spots that we're familiar with, Mulgall and Nogra and Breakfast Creeks and Kedron Brook, reached record heights, which caused 3 separate flash flooding incidents on the 25th and the 26th of January. At that stage, only Oxley Creek, which has a very large flat catchment, could initially contain the water. However, because we're actually quite familiar with creek flooding in Brisbane, no one really worried, even though the rain was very heavy. And really no one was thinking about river flooding at that stage. And to make matters worse, on the 26th of January, the sun was shining. It often seems to do that on floody days. In fact, the newspapers talk about the Australia Day festivities, the planes going overhead, and everyone having their barbecues. And everyone thought that the flood risk had passed on. In fact, the flood engineers thought they had dodged a bullet, really. But what they didn't know was that Newbeath, a gauge up on Oxley Creek, had actually topped 800 millimetres the night before. There's a story of a man called Fred Whitechurch, who was a keen member of the Indooroopilly District Estuary Association. So he was quite familiar with the river. And he took advantage of this dry, sunny day, and he and his son went kayaking near Tennyson. But they found that the Oxley Creek was tumbling into the Brisbane River with a roar like a major plane taking off, with a huge whirlpool on either side. That's how he described it. And he and his son had to paddle very quickly to the banks to survive. So flood warnings were issued and the rescue organisations were mobilised. Now, at that stage, Central Command for Disaster Management lay with the State Disaster Relief Organisation, which was administered with the Police Department. Now, this was a new organisation, really. It had been created after the 1968 storm in Killarney, and it had been tested once, really, in Townsville, when Townsville had Cyclone Althea in 1971. But they had really yet to be tested with a large flood. And this, as I said, was a widespread disaster. They weren't used to dealing with a crisis of this magnitude. They had fairly nondescript uniforms, sort of brown uniforms, and not particularly clear markings. And they knocked on people's doors and people really had no idea who they were. So it wasn't very successful in organising evacuations because people didn't want to respond. So they had to send the police instead. Now, when I say they weren't really prepared, I think the best indication of this is that they didn't actually have any boats. And as we'll see in a flood, boats are pretty essential if you're trying to rescue people. Technology also failed. In the 1893 flood, the telegraph poles washed over and technology failed. And in 1974, the telephone system crashed. Now, this is a common problem. In 2011, the internet crashed. So we've got to work on our technology because if you're going to get people out of harm's way, you've got to find some way of letting them know. So there was really at that stage very little mass distribution of information to the media. And again, as I said, the technology really was a problem. One of the meteorologists I interviewed said he remembers the staff having to travel by boat from the flooded Bureau of Meteorology offices around at one end of Edward Street and then travelling by boat 15-minute intervals to the other end of Edward Street to read the emergency gauges, which were on telephone poles. So there's not a lot of technology going on, which makes it really, really hard. So there's this unfolding disaster going on that people don't really know what's happening. It was published in newspapers and it was broadcast on television. But interestingly, the commercial televisions didn't want to scare the punters, so to say. And it was really only the ABC that had the courage to broadcast the news. And that's not a shameless plug for the ABC, but it is, because the ABC is actually our best broadcaster in times of disasters. So think about that when we're defunding it. People shouted messages across flooded rivers. So there's stories of people at Jindalee standing on one side of the Jindalee Bridge to the other bridge, calling out, screaming out messages, "We're okay, we'll be fine," getting people to be told on the other side. The other thing that happened is we had the radio. Radio was particularly important in the 1974 floods, and people were delivering personal messages on the radio. And so you get to listen to the tapes that are in the State Library. You can hear it. There's the official sort of reports on weather heights. And then in between it says, just saying Mary Smith is okay in Jindalee. And then they're reporting road closures and relief efforts. So they're really quite an interesting oral history of the floods. People flocked to the river to see the floods, which, according to the Australian at the time, reported that on every bridge, crowds stand fascinated by the angry version of their river, once a tranquil, winding waterway. And you can see all the people standing on the bridge looking at the waters below. The newspapers reported that houses were ripped off their stumps, steel walls of factories were torn open, and luxury craft was smashed to matchwood. These people were watching as bits of houses, caravans and other rubbish washed past. So here's the rescues that had to take place. Over 500 people had to be rescued by a combination of local residents and police, the civil defence people, Army and Air Force. The Sunday Mail called the event Brisbane's Dunkirk. Now, the people that flooded had to be found accommodation in schools, churches and community halls, and they accepted meals and clothing and supplies donated from interstate. Private boats and helicopters from an isolated Amberley RAF base had to be used to rescue stranded residents, and they provided the relief. And sadly, we're seeing that in New South Wales at the moment with their floods, that people are having to be rescued from rooftops. Public servants were granted leave to assist in the clean-up, and tradesmen freely offered their services, and the council administered free tetanus injections. So you can sort of see some of the things that are happening at this stage because the disaster of the flood is rapidly unfolding. So I'm just giving you this idea of how these flood heights compare. I'm giving you the Ipswich Heights and the Port Office, which is where the flood gauges are held. So it's important when you're talking to hydrologists, they always say, make sure you say where the flood heights are. The Brisbane Port Office gauge is in Edward Street. As it was mentioned, 14 people died in Brisbane and 2 died in Ipswich. Now, Somerset Dam was there, but it was only able to hold that little bit of water that fell upstream in the Stanley River. And so it couldn't control all those waters I showed you that were downstream. The records suggest that the Somerset Dam did reduce that flood height by 1 metre, so you get an idea of what it would have been. But it's still a significant flood, as you can see. By the 28th of January, more than a third of Brisbane lay underwater. This is a map held by Queensland State Archives, which shows the extent of the river waters inundating our city. The hardest hit suburbs in Brisbane were the affluent riverside suburbs of Chelmer, Sherwood, Graceville and Euronga, and the inexpensive land on the flats at Oxley and Rocklea. The member for Sherwood, who was John Herbert, informed Parliament that between the Oxley Methodist Church on Oxley Road and the river, which was nearly a mile away, every house went under. He estimated that 75% of the Graceville State School children lived in flood-affected homes and 90% of them in Rocklea. Some suburbs in Brisbane were about 2 metres below the river. Approximately 13,000 homes in 17 suburbs were affected by the flood. They were submerged or inundated or damaged. In Brisbane, the estimated flood damage was about 178 million, which is roughly 8 billion today. 8,000 people were left homeless, and some of them never were able to move back into their homes. The velocity of the water destroyed homes. Floors, doors and windows were left warped and buckled, and plywood peeled off the kitchen cupboards. The Telegraph on the 31st of January reported that many were left with only the shells of their former homes, with all furnishings and household equipment left sodden, useless wreckage by the floodwaters. The Courier Mail declared Brisbane a sombre city, with disbelief, hopelessness and defeat etched in the faces of residents as they surveyed the wreckage that was, only a week ago, a lifetime's work. The same paper recorded that men and women wept unashamedly. Shop assistant Joe Rago lived on the Brisbane Corso at Fairfield, and he found that his walls and ceilings were ruined and the floorboards were pushed up by the force of the water. Similarly, a bricklayer described his home in Stimson Street, Fairfield, as drowned, with the doors, floors and windows warped and buckled and the plywood peeling off the kitchen cupboards. The contents of many homes were destroyed, and after the floodwaters receded, damaged possessions could be found piled high on the roadsides. Now, there are moments of levity amongst the tragedy, and after those stories, we always need a little bit of levity to lighten the mood. So you can see these patrons drinking from the second floor of the Regatta Hotel in Toowong. And there's always a winner in floods, and I think it's these guys. Now, the caption at the Brisbane City Council archive says, "Rescuing the beer." Yeah, right. So these are the winners. With Brisbane streets and train lines submerged, watercraft became the transport of necessity. The South East Freeway, the Bruce Highway, the Gold Coast Highway and Ipswich Road, which are all the main roads out of the city, were cut. Only the Story Bridge was usable, and one of the people here today was saying it took hours to get across the Story Bridge. Power was also threatened as the Tennyson Power Station was closed, and all the stockpile of coal out near Swanbank Power Station was all soaked and virtually unusable. So here you can see the power station at Tennyson, well and truly underwater and inoperable for quite a while. On the 27th of January, a gravel barge crashed into Centenary Bridge at Jindalee, and it was feared that the central girder had cracked, so the bridge was closed to all but police and rescue workers. They had to use 4 charges of dynamite and a full load of water to eventually sink that vessel. But the bridge was damaged significantly and it was reduced to 1 lane for 15 months. Now, we didn't have quite as many people in Brisbane, but reducing that road to 1 lane for 15 months would be a disaster. Another drama happened on the 28th of January when the 66,000-tonne tanker called the Robert Miller, which was the biggest vessel ever constructed in Brisbane, swept out of control downstream from the Evans Deacon shipyards and it swung across the river, creating an obstruction to the floodwaters, and it threatened a block of luxury flats. It was hailed by the tug Carlock, and its skipper, Leo Hartis, was hailed a hero. Interestingly, in 2011, the same Leo Hartis was able to help rescue the Moggle ferry. So knowledge is a good thing. So the Brisbane port was closed and cross-river ferries ceased, with many terminals wrecked. The Rockley industrial area was particularly hard hit. Now that's where a lot of our fruit and vegetables come from, and they were just left a stinking, rotting mess. All the freezers were unusable. So we had food shortages for quite a while in 74 as well. There's Yeronga, just the peaks of the houses showing out. Here's all the people's possessions just piled up in skips, again ready for the skips to go to the dump. As we saw in 2011, the Flood Army rallied. Over 15,000 Army personnel were mobilised, with Enid Robertson in Chelmer recalling that they moved in with clean-up equipment, willing and cheerful men and great efficiency. She wrote, "The whole world seemed to be coming to help. Friends, people we hardly knew, the Salvation Army with hot meals, fruit and offers of assistance of every kind. For over a week," she said, "kind hands took away our dirty washing and returned piles of clean, ironed clothing. Volunteers came to scrub and shovel." Graham Garn, who lived in Diane Street in Yeronga, who just happens to be my uncle, recounted there were people and trucks everywhere. Strangers came from everywhere to help. One thing that was actually interesting in 74 is we had a lot more hardwood and possessions that could actually be salvaged, and we did actually save more in 74 than we did in 2011, 22 and 25 because of that. IKEA furniture doesn't really stand up so well to flooding. The other thing that was interesting is a lot more people owned utes, and we were actually more community connected. So there were lots more stories about the local hockey team or the local football team or the local church all rallying to help people. So that really saved a lot more possessions, and we lost a lot more in 2011. And that community dislocation was actually a factor in that. But it was also our building materials. A lot of these earlier houses are raised, so you could get the water out and clean them, whereas now we have a lot more slab on ground. So it's really interesting when you compare the floods, the differences and what we've learned. Sometimes we've learned good things, sometimes we've actually gone backwards. So it's an interesting flood study because of the things that changed. One of the things that did come out of the 1974 flood was the SES. We decided to abandon that Dad's Army version and got the SES. And it's definitely the men and women in orange that we call on a lot in disasters to help us. So that really was a very big lesson from those floods. And we did get our communication strategies with the departments working together a lot better. And we particularly saw that in 2022, where the agencies were really working together. So the council opened makeshift dumps, and their possessions were just scooped up with front-end loaders and dumped in the skips. As one volunteer noted, "We're not just sweeping away the muck, we're sweeping away part of their life." Human kindness and spirit shone through, though, with heartwarming moments amid tragedy. In conclusion, as we commemorate the 50th year anniversary of the 1974 floods, we need to acknowledge the loss of life and property and the trauma caused to many. I would suggest that the last thing we want to see in Brisbane is a repeat of the devastation of the 1974 floods. But we do need to make changes to reduce the hazard. We must support and encourage any council or state government initiatives that address the problem, such as retrofitting houses or building homes with more resilient designs. We need to think about our building materials. I really support the buyback schemes. We just need more of them. And we really need to have the courage to refuse more development applications and need new planning schemes to prevent building on the floodplain. As I was told yesterday, we are building the homes today that we will need to rescue in the future. Instead, we are seeing an escalation of the hazard. We really need to think about how we develop plans to evacuate people in times of flood and ways to make the community more resilient. I think education's a really big part of that, which is why I like doing these talks, because seeing people rescued from rooftops really shouldn't happen. We should be able to communicate in advance and get people out of harm's way. We're very, very good at rescuing, or exceptionally good at rescuing. We're very good at cleanup, but we're not so good about proactive behaviour. And our expenditure shows that as well. We actually spend about 93% now, or 97%, on recovery and 7% on preparation. That's got to shift. Floods will come again, and they may be bigger. We have to make some tough decisions. We have occupied the floodplain, and we have interrupted the river's natural cycle of flood and drought. And in doing so, as my book title suggests, we have created a city problem for the river. Thank you.